and is going to give us a history lesson, which we're very much looking forward to. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the organisers for inviting me to talk to you. And I think I've been given a rather soft talk because I think I gather a few of you had a bit to drink last night, so maybe it can ease you into my talk. So it is kind of a history lesson, but it's also trying to just bring some thoughts together about where we are now and how we got here. So first, I think that some of the barriers of providing PN I broadly categorise as three different domains. One is how to administer PN, and also the nutritional aspect of PN, and also the logistics of PN. So with respect to the history, I think that the pivotal time was actually in the late 1960s. That was this time when Boeing 747 first came onto the market, and as you know, that some of the airlines now retiring the Queens of the Sky. And that was the same time Manchester United actually won the football. At the same time, the Beatles had a #1 hit with Hey Jude. And then also Martin Luther King was shot dead in 1968. But all of these kind of are small things compared to the parenteral nutrition world. In 1969, Dudrick and Wilmore, Dudrick is a surgeon, paediatric surgeon, so was Wilmore. They did some experiments. First, they did experiments on these puppies, and they were able to show that without providing any enteral nutrition and just parenteral nutrition in the puppies, and then providing just normal feed in the other puppy, they were able to show that the growth of both streams were equal, if not better, in the parenteral nutrition arm. That then led them to the very first, it led them to actually providing short-term PN to surgical patients. So they wrote up a paper with about 20 surgical patients, which they were successfully kept alive until they were put onto enteral nutrition. But the momentous time, really, that both Dudrick and Wilmore themselves have said was that the first successful long-term PN for kids actually started in 1969. And that was with a small baby where they resected all the bowel except for 20 centimetres. And at that particular time, that child would have died. And what they did was they applied for ethics approval at their hospital and said that we've done these experiments with puppies, and we've also shown that it could be viable in surgical adult patients. Can we please use this for this particular? We said, yes, you can. And so what they did was that they developed this metabolic bed where they infused the PN via a central line, and then sort of kept the head up. And she was able to be kept alive on the PN for about 140 days or so. But because of the nature of it, they weren't able to continue with the parenteral nutrition, and so it was stopped, and this child subsequently passed away. In London, where Princess Diana and Charles got married. But he was also very instrumental in designing a venous catheter. And he used the stem of feathers as the catheter, and he was the first one to be able to have intravenous infusion. I wish I was his experiment, because he infused wine, ale, and opium and liver antimony into a dog, and surprisingly he survived. The next step came a few years afterwards with Richard Lower, and he was smart enough to say that, well, actually the stem is not quite durable enough, so let's silver coat it. And then it gave the flexibility but also the sturdiness in the catheter, and he was the first one to be able to transfuse a dog-to-dog transfusion using that method. At that particular time, there was a lot of cross-channel rivalry between England and France. And in France, they were like saying, we can do things better. So they then thought, well, why don't we try and cure some of the diseases by transfusing blood from animals to humans? And Jean-Baptiste Denis, he was the first person to be able to do that. And he was able to cure this 16-year-old boy's fever with transfusion from animal, from I think a sheep or a lamb to human. After that, there was a booming experimental stage where everybody was trying to transfuse people with all sorts of different things. But it all came to a halt because one of the other physicians tried to transfuse, I think it was dog blood, into his wife because she was mad, and he thought that he can cure her madness. And he did cure her madness the first time around, but then he came back again. And then they thought, oh, well, if it works, why should it work the first time and not the second time? And then it turned out that he was poisoning his wife because he thought that he was cheating on him with arsenic. And so after that, blood transfusion came to a complete halt after that. During the next kind of 150 to 200 years, very little in terms of intravenous access was advanced. Mostly it was in terms of physiology that came about. But in 1929, Weber-Foschman was the first person to successfully put a catheter into the heart, thereby allowing us to infuse things centrally. And he's a renal physician, I think. And what he really wanted to do was to infuse different medicines into the heart so that they could be given directly to the heart to cause them to work better. His story with his catheter is actually very interesting as well, because he devised this catheter and he wanted to show people that yes, you can stream it all the way up to the heart, but then he couldn't actually convince anyone that he should be doing it to himself. So he convinced a nurse to say that, well, can you please make sure that no one comes into the anesthetic room, and I'm going to put the catheter into myself. But then she said, no, I'm not going to allow you to do that. If you want to do that, then you have to do it on me. So he said, yeah, all right. I don't know why the nurse said she wants to volunteer, but that's how the story goes. So she said, yeah, that's fine. So he strapped her onto the table, but instead of putting the catheter in her, he gave himself an anesthetic and then put it onto himself, and then ran into the radiology unit and then identified that the tip of the catheter was in the heart, thereby allowing us to think about central venous catheters. In the 1940s, polyvinyl chloride catheters came about, but in 1952, people then started to think, well, what about using other venous access? And it wasn't until this Frenchman in 1952 first shown that we can use this subclavian vein for CVC insertion. And then now, I'm not quite sure that you can see all of that, but now we have the very different types of catheter with the Groviac and the Hickman line. The difference between the two are really about the size and about the diameter of the lumen, and then also the availability of different lumens that you can have. So there's single lumen catheter, double lumen catheter, and triple lumen catheter. Although the thoughts nowadays with different guidelines coming out is that a single lumen catheter is probably the best way to go about providing parenteral nutrition, because the more catheter lumens you have, the more infectious rates you will get. So that's in terms of catheters. In terms of method of administration, I think that previously it would have always been continuous, and people thought, well, due to the limitations of oxidation rates, that you really have to just infuse continuously. But then we thought about, well, why don't we cycle? So the concept of cycling, I think that this audience always know, well, very familiar with. It's about shortening the time duration of providing PM. And this has been shown to perhaps affect the decrease in intestinal failure associated liver disease or PM-associated liver disease. In terms of accessory equipment, in the 1960s, they didn't have all the fancy things that we have, like, for example, the administration lines, with the flexible lines that we have and all the different bungs and caps that we've got now. And the pumps have transformed quite a lot in the last 10 to 15 years, from it all being stationary. I don't know if anyone is old enough here to know that in the 70s and 80s, when people were first being sent home on home PM, they had to take these huge pumps home with them, basically transport the hospital pump to home. But now we've got ambulatory pump, which is small and portable, where they can be taken else back to the streets or just stand still at home overnight. But then there's also things like the filters as well. and the filters are inline filters, and there are two different types mainly. One is the 0.22 micron filter, and usually it's for microorganisms, but not all microorganisms can be filtered by this way. And so that's why the aseptic technique of providing parenteral nutrition is so important. But there's also the 1.2 micron filter that's mainly for lipid droplets so that they don't embolize into the lungs. So that's in terms of administration, the accessory areas, but also with PN storage as well. In the beginning, we had used glass bottles, and in the 70s when PN was first introduced into a lot of hospitals, it was glass bottles, individual amino acid, glucose, and lipid being infused into patients on the ward. Then came the polyvinyl chloride bags, but the polyvinyl chloride bags, it was found that it leached a lot of carcinogens. And so therefore then we produce ethyl vinyl acetate bags, which are safer now. In terms of nutrition, we've also made a lot of gains there as well. First, there was a caloric requirement. In the 1960s, there was very little knowledge about what is the caloric requirement for children. And then through time, we developed equations that can estimate the basal metabolic rate, like the Harrison-Benedict equation and the Schofield equation. And if you're interested as well, the Agricultural Organization for UN have on the website a list of all the different ways to calculate basal metabolic rate. But basal metabolic rate only tells one part of the story, because there is also thermogenesis from actually eating with the gut. There's also activity, there's also growth, particularly in children, that makes up the total energy requirement of that patient. And those things only came about in the 70s and 80s that we knew much more. This I probably don't need to educate you guys on, you can probably tell me more about them, but in terms of stability and compatibility of components of PN, and in terms of instability is when the substance actually degrades or deteriorates so that you cannot find the active substance anymore. It's like a building falling down, really. And in terms of incompatibility, it's when the disruption of two coexisting forms. And one example of instability is the Maillard reaction, and I think that you've all seen it if you're working in with PN. So when the PN stands still for a long time, they become that brownish material, and that's because of the amino acid and glucose together with warmth and other things that makes that reaction happen. And in terms of compatibility, this is the calcium phosphate crystal that forms when there's too much of it being put in. In terms of PN components, we had to learn quite a lot as well, because in the beginning, with amino acids, we were using hydrolyzed proteins, because people thought, well, if kids needed milk, then why don't we provide the protein in milk? And then they thought, well, let's give hydrolyzed protein. But what we found with hydrolyzed proteins gave hyperammonemia. So obviously that's a bad thing because people were comatose with it. So then we developed crystalline amino acid with respect to that. And the carbohydrate, we were thinking about, well, how can we put more in a small volume, so carbohydrate components became more concentrated. And as you all know about lipids, we went through from soybean emulsion to mixed MCT, LCT emulsion, to olive oil, which is the Clean Lake, fish oil, which is the Medivan, and then we have the Smoff combination now. I will touch a little bit on, in the end of the talk, about the controversies that comes about with different lipid emulsions. And then, of course, the electrolytes. As we learn more about the different components of electrolytes and how they work in the whole physiology of the body, we put those in PN as well, particularly with calcium and phosphate. Obviously, we knew about sodium and potassium for a long time. Then came with the micronutrients. For a long time, micronutrients wasn't actually put into the PN because people didn't recognize micronutrients efficiency. This is a test for you guys. Can someone tell me what that baby with the rash on the face, what sort of deficiency that baby has? Zinc. Fantastic, excellent. And what about that patient with the eye? What is that trying to show you? Iron deficiency, yes, but there's another one. Say it again? No. Copper deficiency can give anemia as well. And what about the picture in the middle there? Some of you are still waking up. It's trying to show an infant with hypothyroidism, so iodine deficiency. And the two pictures on the left there, it's trying to show that there's neutropenia, and there's also white hair there. What sort of deficiency do you think that would give that? In fact, this last picture there was a case recently presented in LA because they found this deficiency. I don't know if you remember recently in the US, they've had a great trace element shortage, and then they had to take out all the trace elements in the PN, and they've seen quite a lot of micronutrient deficiency because of that. This is a patient with copper deficiency, and as soon as copper was placed back in, the patient's hair went from white to jet black again. This was a patient that was of Asian background. I think a lot of us that have copper deficiency around here, myself. Then we come about with the controversies. And I think that this is part of the talk that a lot of people wanted me to talk about. In the beginning, in the 60s, there was no PN big pharmaceuticals that were producing PN components. It wasn't until later on in the 70s and 80s that big companies came about and said, well, this could be a business venture and people that could be marketing it. So the big companies like the ones that I've shown here, they came about. But of course, there is this current hot topic about bespoke versus standard PN. And I think that it sounds like a lot of the neonatal pharmacists around the room uses standardized PN, is that right? No? You're still doing bespoke PN? But news stories like this one, which was 2 years ago, frightens people about the use of standard PN because you produce things en masse, and then there might be introduction of microorganisms which then kill patients. So these are from the BBC website. But when it comes to evidence for standardized PN and bespoke PN, the evidence actually is showing that with standardized PN, there's less infection rate. And that really comes from the fact that you are manipulating the bags a lot less, and so therefore you're tampering with it a lot less. And so therefore there is less infection there. But also there's cost implications, and that's been shown both in adults and also in children as well, mainly in the neonatal population, not so much in the pediatric population, because there's still a great debate as to what is the best standardized solution for the pediatric age group, because you can go from 5 kilograms to 50 kilograms, and obviously one standardized bag is not going to fit all of them. And I hope, is it possible to click onto that screen? So what I'm going to show you is a video about one of the current...
There's no sound.
Oh, you don't have any sound. Well, I'll talk through it then. So this is a recent study. It's a multi-center study looking at parenteral nutrition use, whether early parenteral nutrition use or late parenteral nutrition use in an pediatric ICU patient is of benefit. So what they did was, this is just a cartoon showing you that, yes, when you're very sick, you need nutrition, otherwise you'll die. But what they did was that this is a study that's originating from Belgium, and then when they had 40 patient children, and then they divided up into 2 groups. It will come about soon, I hope. So they divided the 2 groups into early and late parenteral nutrition. Late parenteral nutrition means that they don't start parenteral nutrition until after a week. Both groups were attempted to have enteral nutrition early, and what they found was that the infection rate with the late parenteral nutrition was significantly less. And also the days in ICU was significantly less as well, although the mortality rate was no different. And this is probably the first big cohort, a randomized control study, a multi-center study that shows that late parenteral nutrition possibly could have, or oily parenteral nutrition possibly can have a detrimental effect in some of our patients. And this is from a New England Journal of Medicine presentation. And this same group from Belgium also was the one that showed that hypoglycemia in patients. Hypoglycemia is associated with increased morbidity and mortality, both in adults and in children. So they're doing a lot of good work in terms of telling us when is the right time to provide nutrition. So this was not the sort of thing that people envisaged in the 1960s, talking about, well, should we be giving nutrition and when we should be giving nutrition. But things that we are now talking about also is, what about some of the things that we took for granted, saying that they were absolutely essential? So I think that all of you have been taught that the essential trace elements were zinc, selenium, well, iron is not a trace element, but chromium and manganese were the essential elements. But more and more in the last 5 years particularly, manganese has been shown that it's a contaminant enough that we probably shouldn't be giving in PN. And in fact, if we gave them, it would be people can become hypermagnesiemic and then have extrapyramidal signs like Parkinson's disease-like signs. And chromium as well, because there's a lot of contamination, maybe we shouldn't be giving chromium either. And of course, lipid, this can give a whole entire conference on lipid about how much to give and what to give. So it's interesting because a conference that I went to last week had these animal experiments from Melbourne. That it was an intestinal failure model where they used piglets, and then they resected 75% of their bowel. And what they found was that without giving parenteral nutrition, they found the same changes as IFLD in these piglets' liver. So we really need to rethink about, well, is it really the parenteral nutrition that's causing the harm in the liver disease in these kids, or really is the process between the gut and the liver talking that dysregulation that's causing the liver disease? So, but anyways, the current controversy in the clinical nutrition world is, well, should we be giving less lipid when patients have intestinal failure associated with disease, and what sort of lipid we should be giving? And it's interesting because the Americans are about 20 years behind the Europeans, and they just got their SMOF approval in adults, and they're debating as to, oh, how can we give it in kids? And then we're thinking, well, look at the Europeans and the Australians, we've been giving it for 20 years, why don't you just ask us? So the last slide really is talking about the future of PN, and I think that these are some of my own thoughts, and I wish that some of the clever pharmacists around the table, around the room, would be able to take that up. What about different methods of delivering PN? Because we've been using the same method of delivering PN, although we talk about cycling, but we really need to think about, well, for you and I, we actually eat about 3 times a day. Some of us don't eat at all, like Mr. Sharif, because he's busy transplanting all day for 12 hours or 14 hours. But our insulin secretion is mirrored with our intake of food. But that's not the case with our PN patients. Because of the restrictions of oxidation and the volume, we always say that we have to give it either continuously or over a 12-hour period. But why can't we give more PN in a very short space of time so that we can induce the same type of insulin level so that we can mimic normal physiological response? And when you sit down and calculate, actually a 12-hour infusion of PN, we're already exceeding the oxidative rates that we've confined ourselves before. So I think that we need to think about how we give the PN. And also different methods of delivery as well. What about transdermal infusion of PN in patients who have got intact skin? Because we've been doing transdermal delivery of medicine, so why can't we do that for PN as well? And I think that there's lots to be said about thinking around the problem instead of just using the same thing all the time. And that's the end of my talk.
Thank you very much. That was a fantastic tour of TPN. Have we got questions from the floor? There must be some. We're all using TPN. I guess my question really is about the liver, obviously
that being my area. I said earlier, we've noticed that in our centre, we hardly see patients now needing liver transplants because of TPN-induced liver disease, which is amazing. What do you think are the main strategies that have improved that outcome in children?
I think it's with everything, it's multifactorial, but I think the most pivotal thing that has changed is that we put a lot of emphasis into starting feeds early. And I think that by starting feeds early, you are actually allowing that liver and intestine crosstalk a lot earlier, thereby securing the decreasing inflammation in the liver. And so therefore, if you get people onto enteral feeds a lot earlier, then that's, I think, will have an impact on cholestasis.
And do you use any taurine, any of these other drugs to try and improve it?
Yes, we often would, I think as a reflex, I think vitamin U, as we call it, it's like we give it to everybody. But I think there are some studies which shows that oxypolyacid does help in reducing cholestasis. But the thing is that there are so many different things happening at the same time to that child that it's very difficult to tease out that that's the only thing. I think that frequent review of patients is probably what has driven a lot of the success, and of course the nutrition support team around the world allowing the children to be looked at on a daily basis and pushing forward with enteral feeding is probably the most. Just to give you an example, in the hospital at the moment there's a patient on the ward that's from another hospital, let's not name the hospital, and this patient's bowel was somehow, when it was reconnected, was reversed. So instead of the ileum being at the distal end, the ileum was actually on the proximal end. So of course she wasn't be able to eat because she kept on vomiting. So when that was realised that the bowel was the wrong way around, it was reversed, she was able to eat, but because she wasn't reviewed frequent enough, she was still on PN. And I can tell you that over the last, she's been here with us for a week. From 7 nights of PN, we got her to, from like 90 mils per kilo of PN, we got it down to like 35 mils per kilo now, and she's going to come off within a week. So I think that when centres say that we've got 10 or 20 patients on PN, really you need to look at why is it that these patients on PN? Is it because of the physiological problems that they have, or is it because the team can't even be bothered looking at the script and reviewing the patients often enough? That's a roundabout way of telling you that it's important to review patients regularly.
Start feeding them.
Hi, we have some long-term patients with intestinal failure on home PN. And one of the biggest challenges we have ones who don't have intestinal failure too, is getting enough vitamin D in them. And the vitamin D levels are constantly low. It's really hard to get vitamin D, extra vitamin D in here because of stability issues. So I was wondering if you've come across this problem and what you do to overcome it or challenge it.
Personally, I think that there are two issues here. One is that there has been a big drive and kind of shift with respect to the upper limit of vitamin D level being the true reflection of disease process, or of deficiency. So suddenly, overnight, everybody was vitamin D deficient, including you and I probably. So that's one thing. The other thing is that in terms of, if you felt that the patient did have clinical vitamin D deficiencies, there are other routes that you can give, like IM routes, and sometimes we have to give that way because of compatibility issues, like you've said.
Yeah, that's what we're doing.
Yes.
Have you got any views on whether you should monitor or not monitor lipid levels, so triglycerides or anything like that?
So we do monitor lipid levels, and I think that different units will have different protocol in terms of monitoring. You're laughing because it's a bit contentious.
We were discussing this last night as to the rights and wrongs of measuring triglycerides.
And when to start?
And when to start. in our hospital, we measure triglycerides before PN and also during the course of PN as well. And that's mainly because we feel that if someone we're infusing lipid over and above their normal physiological ability to accept the rate of infusion, then I think that we need to either decrease or stop the infusion to allow the body to process whatever it's in the bloodstream. But the problem really is that different patients have different etiology for why they require PN. Let's say, for example, patients who have HLH will have high triglyceride to begin with. So therefore, well, do you not give lipid or do you give lipid? And there's no consensus as to what it is, but my personal view is that you should give lipid because they're going to be deficient in lipid otherwise, because they're using lipid is their quasi-marker for the inflammatory process that's happening. So if you draw all the lipid from their body away, they're never going to be able to process that and regenerate and become better. But at what level you should give? Well, we usually give minimal amount and then see, and if it's the same level, then we'll try and achieve whatever the caloric requirement is. Does that answer your question? And about measuring triglyceride, yes, we do measure it. And it depends on how you measure it as well. So for example, in our institution, we give lipid over a 20-hour period, but I know that there's some institutions that give lipid over a 24-hour period. And then therefore, I'm not quite sure when you measure the triglyceride, whether you're just taking sample off what you're infusing, or whether you are truly reflecting on what's actually in the intravascular space. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have any more questions? Oh, yeah.
Thank you for the day on Cornwall. I enjoyed that. I was intrigued by your comments about later nutrition in children, I think, rather than neonates. And I imagine that there may be a balance to be drawn between late nutrition in terms of infection and late nutrition in terms of nutrition. Where do you think that might lie? I guess our sort of gut feeling, if that's the right word, would be for nutritional purposes to start as soon as possible, but maybe you're telling us that we ought to think a bit more carefully.
Well, I think that study in particular, enteral nutrition was attempted in both groups. So they did not deprive the latent parenteral nutrition group of no nutrition at all, although the enteral nutrition was not at the same level to caloric requirement stage. And then what they did was that then they gave late parenteral nutrition after 7 days. But I think that what I was trying to show is that the concept of providing nutrition has changed. I think that what we've always thought was that nutrition is good, and nutrition is good because we all need nutrition, we eat every day, so why shouldn't these kids be? But the basis of that, the late nutrition, is that when you're in critical illness, you're in this different state of health. Instead of having the ability to just regulate normal physiology, you're shifting the physiology to that of pro-inflammatory response. And then by giving parenteral nutrition, you may be shifting that ability of autophagy, so the ability for the mitochondria to absorb different toxins from the inflammatory process. Because the body is saying that, well, we've got enough energy around and we don't need to activate that system. And I think that that's the basis of that clinical trial, is to see whether there is actually a difference between giving nutrition early on and shifting that inflammatory process, which is not just about, TNF-alpha or any of those pro-inflammatory cytokines. It's also about how the body reacts to the inflammatory state. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Right, that's fantastic. Thank you very much.